What is most important is figuring out where a policymaker is and what matters to him or her so that we can talk to them in their language. You don't want to talk to somebody about what Jesus said if their issue is fiscal responsibility. And by the same token, if somebody's a fiscal conservative, you want to bring to them the facts about the high cost of the death penalty and how we could do better for victim families with something other than executions. And you don't want to go to them and talk about what Jesus said, right? So the number one thing is find out where they're at.
Welcome to Democracy on Fire. So glad you're here. My guest today is Abraham Bonowitz, Abe for short, co-founder and executive director of Death Penalty Action. Abe has a long career in this field. He's been at the center of the movement to abolish the death penalty for nearly 4 decades and has had a hand in virtually every state-level legislative repeal of capital punishment, from New Jersey in 2007, which was the first state to repeal since '64, through more recent victories in a number of states, including Colorado, Virginia, and Delaware. He's worked with the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, the Catholic Mobilizing Network, and Amnesty International USA, and he's co-founded grassroots abolition organizations in Florida, South Carolina, Utah, and Idaho. He's also known for having been arrested on the grounds when a Supreme Court arguments were being heard, and is named as the lead plaintiff in a suit that still today determines what First Amendment activity can take place on the Supreme Court grounds, Bonowitz versus U.S. Thought that was really interesting. So have I left anything significant and important out of your history that you'd like to elaborate on now?
Just that my kid is 21 and making more money than I am, and got 3 cats and just happily doing the work that we do and living life.
Well, thank you so much, Abe, for joining me. I really appreciate it and look forward to hearing about your experiences and your insights into this issue. And I really appreciate all the work you've done on this over your career. Could you just briefly summarize why you oppose the death penalty?
Sure. And thanks for having me on, Kay. I haven't always opposed the death penalty. And in fact, the first time I confronted this issue as an adult, I argued in favor of the death penalty. And I then set off to try to prove those anti-death penalty people wrong. And in trying to prove them wrong, I found out that everything I believed about the death penalty, the truth was the opposite. I thought we had a system that was fair, that always got it right, that did justice for victim families. And it turns out none of those things were true. The thing that actually made me jump from one side of the fence to the other was learning that you have to kill in a state that has a death penalty and also in a county that has a death penalty in order to face the possibility of an execution. And that alone made me think, well, gosh, it's not fair if I go to a different county and commit the same kind of horrific crime that I'm not eligible for the death penalty. How is that fair? And that's what made me jump from one side of the fence to the other in terms of my mind. My heart took a bit longer to move because I used to say, well, if we could make it fair, if we could make it equal, I'll pull the switch myself. But then I got involved in particular with murder victim family members who oppose the death penalty, the families of people on death row, even corrections people who had carried out executions and then were tormented by nightmares and addiction and all the things that come in post-traumatic stress. That helped me understand that what we're doing with a system that asks state workers to take, defenseless human beings out of a cage and to kill them, in addition to all the other things where we're saying to victim families, we're wait till we kill the guy and then you'll feel better, but that's only eligible to this tiny percentage of victim families. All those things helped move my heart on this issue to a place where now it's not, I'm very clear, it's not about the criminal and whether that person deserves a particular punishment or is going to get it, but more about us and who we are and what we as people and we as our collective government can be trusted with in terms of fairness and accuracy in particular. So those, it took me a few years to make that transition. And, I'm still learning about this issue. I've been doing this work for almost 40 years now on some level. I appreciated the introduction, by the way. It was more lofty than I would say for myself. Uh, but in any case, I'm just grateful to be in a place where I can be in leadership in this work on a day-to-day basis. This is what I do with my life.
And so right now you're in your car in Texas?
Correct.
And what are you doing there?
Well, yesterday there were two executions in the country yesterday. One was in Oklahoma. And there's lots of things we could talk about with that case. But in particular, in Texas, yesterday evening, they conducted their 600th execution since 1982. 600. That's 34% of the now 1,666 executions that have taken place in the United States since 1977, when we resumed executing under the new laws, the current laws. And that's 34% of all those executions. You have to add up the next 5 states to get close to them, as many people as Texas has executed. Now, if that weren't enough, and some people are perfectly fine. I mean, of course, just this year, in January and February, the country of Iran executed 600 people. And here it's taken Texas since 1982 to get there. Two different things, right? Yesterday, history was made also in this case. The man's name is Eddie Busby. And even the prosecutor and the prosecutor's expert about intellectual disability agreed with the defense that Eddie Busby was intellectually disabled such that he did not rise to the level of being able to be executed, according to the expert witnesses. Again, both the defense and the prosecutor agreed. And yet the judge in the case said, we're going to go ahead and kill him anyway. And then the arguments were, can we have a hearing about this? And because it was too late to have the hearing, the question before the court became, did we cross all the T's and dot all the I's? And that's a way to simplify it. But last night, the U.S. Supreme Court, which I think it was in 2002, made it so that we don't, they passed, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Atkins versus Virginia that we're no longer going to execute people with intellectual disability. But they didn't set a definition of that. There's another case that's before the U.S. Supreme Court right now, it'll probably be ruled on in the next few weeks, certainly before the end of the term at the end of June, that is thought to be going to redefine what equates to intellectual disability. And part of the question in that case, and again, I'm not an attorney, but this is my understanding of it, is that what do you do when you have multiple IQ measurements over a person's lifetime? So you might have an IQ measurement of 70 under one test at a certain time, and you might have one of 75 or 78, which is still, not the brightest bulb in the pack, if you will. And that's probably not the right way to put it, but the point is that they're going to decide on this. And what happened yesterday is they decided that so the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals last Friday night ruled and granted a stay. There were a panel of 3 justices. One said 3 judges. One said he wouldn't give a stay, but one said we should hear the arguments, and the other said we should wait for the outcome of Ham. This ruling, this case that's before the court right now, and that stay was in place until yesterday. So today is Friday. On Monday, the state attorney general in Texas asked the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn this stay and allow them to resume, to proceed with the execution. And the legal filings in that went back and forth Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and it wasn't until after 5 o'clock Central Time, after 6 o'clock Eastern Time, that the court said, okay, go ahead, and you can go ahead and execute the guy, to a blistering dissent from Justice Ketanji Brown, basically saying, why can't we wait until the outcome of this other case? Why can't we wait and hear the merits on this argument? And really what this has done, since we're talking about democracy on fire, this is the U.S. Supreme Court burning down the precedent that it established in 2002 with the Atkins decision. Now there are, and it suggests that when they do rule in the Ham case, that they're going to strike down what has been previously a protection for the least among us, the people with intellectual disabilities. So a lot of people thought this guy wasn't going to get executed. We were outside the prison protesting, being present, tolling our bell, holding our signs, making sure that the media and the government knew that there was opposition to that execution. And we're in the middle of an execution spree of sorts. There were 2 executions last week. There were just 2 yesterday, and there's 3 next week. So we're seeing this spike in executions over a 3-week period that are totally unrelated to each other, and yet they're, what's happening. And that does lead us to what's happening today, which is May 15th, which is the deadline for public comment on this new proposal by the Department of Justice, or the Department of Injustice as it is under the current regime. And that new rule that they're trying to impose is, the Attorney General's idea of how to implement Donald Trump's executive order on the death penalty, which he signed within hours of taking office when he was first inaugurated in his second term, to expedite executions. So this rule, what it's going to do is basically allow the Department of Justice to help facilitate the appeals process at the federal level. In other words, to smooth that path and make it go faster so that we can have more executions more speedily. That's the agenda of the current Trump administration and the bootlickers that are enabling that and trying to move it forward. So, what we've been doing the last few weeks since this was announced is organizing people to express their comments on the government response page, which is established. Just sent out an email this morning telling people today is the deadline to get your comments in. And the thing about the comments with this sort of thing is that now the policy is that the government has to respond to every comment. So we and many other organizations have been trying to get many people, as many people as possible, to put in their comments about how this will be a bad public policy.
So, Abe,
Yeah.
are the spree of executions that you just mentioned, are those being done by the states or by the federal government?
Now
By the states.
so we have the death penalty in the states that choose to have it. Legislatively, or whose courts have not struck it down. There's 2 different ways that you have the death penalty. If you've ever had it in a state, 12 states have never had the death penalty under the current law, since 1972 when all the laws were struck down. 12 states did not add it, which means 38 states did. And we've actually pulled that back to now 23 states don't have the death penalty. 27 do in law. Only about a dozen of them actually are using it. But then you also have the federal death penalty and the military death penalty. And there's 4 people on the military death row. There were 40 people on the federal death row, but we ran a campaign that was successful in getting President Biden to commute. We were asking him to commute all of the federal death sentences as well as the military death sentences. He ended up leaving the military, and he left 3 terroristic type of people on the federal death row. So there's currently 3 people on death row, but they're not far along in their process that they could get an execution date. They still have appeals
So
left. Yes.
let,
So these
let me ask you about,
are in the states.
I wanted to ask you about one of the things I'd read in this new DOJ policy directive that just recently came out, that the federal prisons were being told to expand the range of methods used for executions to include firing squads, gas asphyxiation, and electrocution, along with the other major lethal and injection of drugs. So what's the effect of that? And is that really going to change anything? And why do we need to go back to firing squads?
Well, that's bluster. Okay, that's just them pushing people's buttons by using rhetoric that will raise alarm, of course, or raise people's expectation or interest, whatever it is. To be clear, death penalty action doesn't take a position on how we kill our prisoners. We are concerned that we kill our prisoners in a space where the system is as broken as it is. Okay. Now, in the first Trump administration, they did do some rule changes and some policy changes that they could do without changing the law that basically stated that federal executions could take place in any state or federal institution using any available method of execution. So this is actually not new. In stating that in this thing, it's all they're really doing is reinstating what they already added in in the first Trump administration, and then in the Biden administration, um, Attorney General the Attorney General basically held a review of all those things, and then they never were conducting executions, so I'm not even sure if they ever actually scaled it back, but that's what that was about. Okay. Now,
Okay. Well,
so just to speak to the execution methods, because this is an issue that's going on in the States right now. And in fact, there's a man scheduled to be executed, I think June 11th in Alabama, who is challenging gas suffocation as the method of execution for him. That's a new method of execution under this in the United States. It's about 2 years old now. What they're doing is basically replacing oxygen with nitrogen gas, pure nitrogen gas, using like a firefighter's respirator mask, a piece of safety equipment. So they put the mask on the prisoner and then exchange the oxygen for nitrogen, and that person suffers minutes of conscious oxygen deprivation, and then more minutes of unconscious oxygen deprivation until they die. And witnesses to that, other than state officials, have said it's horrific, and there's no question that this person is going through a traumatic and torturous experience. So the man that's scheduled to be executed in Alabama on June 11th is challenging that and actually having a court case about it. So we'll see what happens with that method. Also happening is because lethal injections are not using poison, they're using legitimate therapeutic drugs that are used in hospitals every day. I mean, I've had midazolam. Anybody that's had a colonoscopy, for example, may have had midazolam. What was used here in Texas last night is a drug called pentobarbital, which is also commonly used. I've had several animals put to sleep using pentobarbital, and for whatever reason, it works great on animals. I've had 2 dogs die in my arms, and I'd like to go that peacefully within a minute. Doesn't seem to work quite that way for people. And the thing is that the manufacturers of the drugs don't want these are drugs that are used for saving life and for healing people, and they don't want them used to be killing people. So the pharmaceutical companies are not selling them to the states. So therefore, the states in Texas, they're going to, let's call it compounding pharmacy, that will make up the stuff as they need it. And that's not always ideal, although it seems to be working just fine here in Texas. So that's why states are shifting. Also, because when you have to, there've been a number of executions by lethal injection where the struggle has been getting an IV going in a person's arm. If a person has weak veins, they're very, very old, anything like that, then it may be hard to get an IV going. And there have been real botched situations where, in fact, in Alabama, one of the reasons they moved to gas is because 2 executions in a row were people that they ended up having to send them back to their cells still alive because they weren't able to establish an IV, which is another horrific experience, if you will, that you're ready to be killed. You're on the gurney, you're strapped down, and for hours they're sitting there trying to poke you and get you going with an IV, and then they can't, and they have to send you back. So that's one of the reasons why they went to gas.
so
And
Abe,
yes, go ahead.
I'll let you comment on these. I just want to mention a couple of the big ones that have stood out for me. The racial and social economic disparities in the application of the death penalty, that it's not being uniformly applied, and that people of color are much more likely to be executed. And all of those reasons, I'm sure come into your work, but as you try to persuade people to change their opinions on this, and so we can change policy, what do you emphasize, and what are What things are most effective in your opinion?
Well, thank you for all that, Kay. You just sort of did my job in telling people what are all the concerns that people should have. One clarification I'll make, though, is that with the racism of the death penalty is really seen in the race of the victim, not in the race of the killer. That has an impact too. But 80% of the people who've been executed in this country have been executed for since 1977 have been executed for the murder of white people, even though people of color are the victims of violent crime more than half the time. So that's an important distinction. But to be clear, I don't see it my job. I don't see it as my job to change anybody's mind. Our work is to find the people that agree with us and get them to do something. And that something is to make sure that our policy makers understand that their voters don't want the death penalty. This is how we've abolished the death penalty in New Jersey, New Mexico, Connecticut, Maryland, New Hampshire, Colorado, Virginia, Washington, and also the courts have struck it down in Delaware and New York and Washington State, and we've been able to keep reintroduction from happening. This is all because of the advocacy that we do as organizers to help legislators know that their constituents, their voters, don't feel the need for the death penalty. And really, Kate, what is most important is figuring out where a policy maker is and what matters to him or her so that we can talk to them in their language. So, for example, you don't want to talk to somebody about what Jesus said if their issue is fiscal responsibility. And by the same token, if somebody's a fiscal conservative, you want to bring to them the facts about the high cost of the death penalty and how we could do better for victim families with something other than executions. And you don't want to go to them and talk about what Jesus said, right? Or whatever it is that you want to find ways to reach people where they're at. So the number one thing is find out where they're at. So for me, just quickly, I'll just share with you in New Jersey, when we were organizing, my own legislator never said how she was. She was a Republican woman. She never said how she was going to vote. But so we made sure that she heard from us. Now, this is a person who represented 70,000 people in her district. And after she voted for abolishing the death penalty, which we did in 2007, she wrote to each of us who had written to her. And she said, I received somewhere around 200 letters asking me to vote one way or the other on this bill, and only 10 of them said keep the death penalty. So the point is, out of 70,000 people, it only took a couple hundred people to help her see that there wasn't this high demand for executions. And that's the work that we do, is the organizing to make sure that policymakers can hear from people whose vote they care about. They don't want to hear from people in Europe. They don't want to hear from people in California or Alaska. They want to hear from their voters. And this is true on whatever issue you're organizing around. That's how you move people. And now today, right now, we have this situation where, if you want to keep Donald Trump happy, then you do whatever he thinks as a Republican. And we're hopeful that in the moments and the time once Donald Trump is no longer president, and the sooner the better, then Republicans can begin to have a conscience vote and to have a conscience themselves and stand where they feel, because all of these legislative victories that have happened have been bipartisan. It's not just Democrats; it's Republicans who come at this from a fiscal responsibility perspective, or from a faith perspective, or from a coming to understand this risk of executing the innocent, or coming to understand that the death penalty actually makes things worse for victim families, not better. And we can do better for all victim families rather than this tiny percentage where there's a promise of an execution maybe in a couple of decades, and then you can feel better. What if we were to do things that serve the needs of all victim families from the moment that they're in a space of the aftermath of murder, which is always awful. So that's the approach that we take at Death Penalty Action, is shining a spotlight on the death penalty, making sure people know this is happening, and also finding the people that agree with us or that we agree with and giving them the right things to do. Sometimes the choir isn't singing the right song.
Individual allies who want to help can find you at your website?
People find us at deathpenaltyaction.org, or because of the big news that we just had, I'm quoted in numerous news articles in Newsweek and whatever, and they read about it and they look us up that way. So that's really the work, is is finding ways to use the mass media, which is a whole different thing than it was 20 years ago in terms of finding ways to reach people, but giving people the tools to take action in an impactful way. And sometimes, when we're up against an execution, sometimes the impact is on us, that we can't just sit and do nothing, that we have to do something. And so for some people that means putting on a t-shirt, wearing a button, signing a petition, that sort of thing, going to a demonstration.
Well, thank you, Abe, for chatting with me and sharing your insight and experiences and shedding a light on this, really what's a dangerous concentration of power that our government has to just kill citizens. And I'm particularly persuaded by knowing that more than 190 people on death row in the U.S. have been exonerated.
I'd say it's over 200 now.
Over 200. And even if the system of justice were perfect, which it is not, executing an innocent person cannot be undone or corrected. And our current administration, Trump and his followers, have just gone all in on killing whoever they deem has, deserves it.
And that's the authoritarian regime that we're under right now. So thanks for having me, and thanks for having this conversation. And I hope people who want to get involved or do something can find us at deathpenaltyaction.org.
Well, thank you, Abe. Thank you so much. Democracy is on fire, and voting is how we extinguish the flames of fascism. Find Democracy on Fire at United America Network or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, liking, and sharing.
Amen.